Well, hello and welcome to the first in this series of webinars on skills and principles for good conflict management. My name is Caroline Brooks. I will be speaking in English, and my co-moderator is Bhavika Solanki. We are part of the movement building team in the International Secretariat. Today, we are joined by our guests, Heather Hoffman and Maya Vishwa, two external conflict resolution experts who will talk to us about repairing from within, navigating internal conflict in mission-driven teams. This webinar series is part of a program of work to support conflict competency within the movement. In 2024, Amnesty adopted a new conflict resolution process which focuses on the importance of early intervention and relational means to resolving conflicts. The process is a step-by-step guide. We also established an internal network of colleagues who are able to offer guidance on conflict resolution. This network is known as the Conflict Resolution Resource People, or CRRPs. In addition, we have recruited an external roster of expert conflict resolution practitioners who can offer direct support to help with conflict resolution, coaching, and capacity building. Maya and Heather are two of the experts on our roster. At the end of the webinar, we will share details of where you can find out more about the conflict resolution process, the CRRPs, and the external roster. This webinar will last 1 hour, which includes a presentation of about 20 minutes by Heather and Maya, followed by Q&A and discussion. The Q&A function will open as soon as the presentation is finished. Please also feel free to raise your hands and ask questions directly at that time. Finally, a reminder to please keep your microphones muted unless you are given the floor. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Amnesty Leadership website after the session. Heather and Maya, thank you so much for joining us today. We are all really looking forward to your presentation. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Caroline. Hello, everyone. I am Heather Hoffman, and part of a partnership between Maya and myself called Maya Hoffman Vishwa Peace Partners. My background is in psychology. I am a licensed clinical social worker and practicing therapist. I join you all from the West Coast of the United States, and I've been in practice for about 20 years, supporting both individuals, families, organizations in working through conflict. So we bring to you today some insights about how to cope with conflict in the workplace and how to repair. Maya, over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm the other half of Hoffman Vishwa Peace Partners. My name is Maya Vishwa, and I'm currently joining from London. I'm a negotiation and conflict resolution specialist with a background in policy, and my main focus is on helping individuals and organizations navigate complexity, build authentic connections, and drive meaningful change, particularly through conflict resolution. And yeah, we're very excited to run through an introduction to some of the support that us and the other people on the conflict resolution roster can support you with today.
So the focus of the session today is repairing from within, navigating internal conflict in mission-driven teams. So at Amnesty International, we know that you all join us from all areas of the organization. You may be a researcher, you may be a writer, you may be in development or on the board or a governing leader. However, we know that most of you are connected because you are all working on a shared vision and mission, which means that your work has the power to be very impactful and meaningful, both personally and organizationally. Now, we all know that conflict in relationships is inevitable, right? Conflict in the workplace is also quite inevitable. And especially in NGOs and in work like that of Amnesty International, when people are personally invested, often because of their own individual experiences or collective histories, conflict in the workplace is even more common. What we'd like to show you in our time together today, though, is that although conflict is unavoidable, it's not necessarily destructive. It can actually be possible to repair conflict in a healthy way and to have it actually improve team dynamics and organizational dynamics. Conflict can most often become harmful in situations where uncomfortable or difficult conversations are avoided or are escalated or personalized, all of which can happen when our emotions or tensions run high. This can also lead to trust in teams being broken down over time. When dealt with in the right way, though, not that there's a right or a wrong way, but when dealt with in a productive way, conflict can also make a team healthier. It can help build connection and mutual understanding, and it can help diverse teams grow and become closer. So for both leaders and teams, in order to be able to move from conflict to growth, it's crucial to be able to distinguish between destructive conflict cycles and opportunities for repair, both of which we'll be talking to you about in the next few minutes. As we move through the presentation today, we'll pose a few reflection questions for you. As we noted at the beginning, we'll save the questions, the live questions, for the Q&A period here in the last 40 minutes of our presentation, but we would love for you to reflect on these questions as we go through. So the first one is to have you think about a conflict that you've seen recently in your team or your organization. What was actually at risk in the conflict, or what was the cause? And what do you think the impact was on the people and on the work?
Thank you, Heather. So really building off what Heather has said, in mission-driven organizations like Amnesty, conflict is not unusual, and I'm sure we all know it's inevitable some of the time. Because all of you care so deeply about the mission, you bring different experiences and different passions, and the stakes feel much higher because the work is important, and it's often about human dignity, it's about justice, it's about peace. And that's intense and that's powerful, but it also means that disagreements can sometimes quickly become painful. So what I'm going to run through now is identifying core types of conflict. And what we're trying to show you is that it's so important to name and be able to identify those conflicts as a first step, because once we're able to identify them, we're better able to address them in a productive and constructive way. So on the slide, as you can see, the first type is process conflict. Process conflict is essentially disagreements about how decisions are made. So if I were to present you a situation, for instance, staff may believe that certain choices in an organization should involve conversation and dialogue, but perhaps there's a crisis. And during a crisis situation, leaders might feel the urgency to respond quickly without consulting the rest of the team. Neither side in this situation is wrong per se, but when expectations like this don't align, it's easy for staff to feel excluded or not heard. And it's also easy for leaders to feel unsupported for the choices that they make. And that gap is really what can affect trust in the system that is really meant to hold the movement together. The second conflict, as you can see, is task conflict, which is really about what gets prioritized in a day-to-day. So imagine one team is pushing hard for resources to be put into a visible global campaign for a crisis or a situation. But another team feels that the same resources should maybe be put into research. Again, both are vital, neither of them is wrong, but choosing between them in human rights situations can feel like competition. And because, again, everyone is so driven by the mission and feels very passionately about the work that they're doing, these disputes rarely feel neutral. They can become emotional, and they really touch on people's values and their sense of justice. Next comes relationship conflict, which is probably the most common one that you'd be able to notice. It's really centered on trust and dynamics between people. And I'm sure we all have experienced this with family members, with friends, with colleagues, even with our partners. And usually it starts in very small ways: misunderstandings, unspoken frustrations, or even different communication styles or working styles. But over time, what starts out small can build, especially if it's not talked about and not addressed. And people who might have once collaborated easily can find it difficult to work with each other or speak to each other. And at this point, it's no longer about clashing personalities. It's really about whether people are able to work side by side towards a shared mission. And finally, we want to talk about identity and power conflict. This is probably the deepest layer of conflict that we want to discuss today because it touches on belonging. Whose voices carry weight in meetings? Who in the company or who in the organization has access to decision-making spaces? For instance, something that we see a lot is that staff from marginalized groups feel their lived experiences are not recognized, while others, maybe even in more junior positions, feel that they don't have the same resources or representation because they're junior. These are very common issues that we see in all organizations, especially human rights organizations, because they, again, reflect the values of inclusion, fairness, and dignity that organizations like Amnesty champion. So what we're really pointing to today is that conflict, no matter how small, it doesn't stay contained. And it happens across different levels of the organization. A disagreement within one team can very easily ripple across departments. Tensions between managers and staff can grow into deeper feelings of mistrust. And disagreements between country sections can slow or fracture the movement on a global level. This is why it's so important to identify the type of conflict as a first step. Because when we are able to recognize what this is, whether it's a question of process or priority, relationship or power, we can create space to respond in the right way, to respond with care. And this will hopefully mitigate or prevent mistrust from spreading. Conflict inside a human rights organization it goes beyond workplace friction. It directly affects whether you, as staff members or leadership, are able to feel connected to the mission on the inside, but still deliver on what the mission is promoting on the outside. Off to you, Heather.
So when conflict does arise, we often fall into what we call conflict traps, or different patterns of how we respond to conflict. One such trap that we fall into is when our stress response system gets triggered and we respond to a conflict in a threatened state rather than a calm and grounded state. When this threat response in our brains gets activated, we typically respond in one of four ways, and you may have heard these before. Fight, which is we respond escalating with fight. Flight, or run away. Freeze, which is basically pause and be frozen or stuck and have difficulty responding. Or fawn, which is people pleasing, trying to please our way out of it and avoid further conflict. So we want you to imagine a situation where you are out in nature and you're confronted by a dangerous animal. We know that in that situation, your survival instincts and this threat response system in your brain would take over, and you might respond in one of those four ways, right? You might fight back the angry, dangerous animal. You might run away, trying to outrun it. You might freeze or play dead, or you might people please or animal please and just try not to upset it and get it upset with you. Right? Well, we know that we actually can have the same internal response to conflict or to conceptual dangers in our environment as we might to physical dangers like a wild animal. Now, we know in the workplace, most of us aren't going to respond to conflict with, throwing punches at one another. We hope, right? But these responses can look a little bit differently at work. By fight response, that might look like raising our voices a little bit or becoming really irritated with our colleagues if we get to a certain level of upset. We might verbally attack others or be defensive or threatening. More of that withdrawal, the flight, fright, freeze, might be avoidance or withdrawal from conversations. We might start to think, well, I guess it's time to look for another job because the thought of trying to work through conflict becomes unmanageable or overwhelming. We might engage in intense people pleasing, or stop talking in meetings, or start ignoring our own needs. We see this very often when people are personally invested in the work and afraid of losing something as a result of workplace conflict. They sacrifice their own well-being in an effort to try to avoid or to stop the conflict. Now, in these conflict traps, our past experiences can also make our reactions in the present even stronger. So sometimes we have what we call conflict buttons, which are like emotional raw nerve endings or places where we're particularly sensitized to conflict. Sometimes something in the present moment reminds us of a time in the past when we were hurt, or even a time in our families or our families of origin where we worked through conflict in a certain way. And that pattern is showing up in the present as adults, even in our work. So sometimes, because of our past buttons getting pushed, our responses in the present can be out of proportion or bigger than the current trigger really merits. Our buttons might get pushed even out of individual differences. So, for example, maybe a procrastinator at work is paired with someone who likes to plan ahead on projects. This can create conflict. This can push a button, and we can respond in an even bigger way than necessarily fits the situation. So often when we're not aware of these conflict triggers or buttons, our responses can get even stronger. We might then react, which is another conflict trap. And we might, in our reacting, push another person's buttons, and then they react. And we get stuck in a cycle of conflict that can be quite negative and can turn into a downward spiral. Sometimes this then deepens our cycle of escalation or avoidance. So the important point to know with conflict traps is that conflict isn't just about bad behavior or responding in a bad way. Often it's more of a signal. It may be a signal that our values, our needs, or our systems are out of alignment in some way. And it's an opportunity to figure out what's coming up for each of us and how can we work to find a common understanding and a path forward. So when you start to notice repeating patterns of conflict in the workplace or in your life, it might be valuable to explore what is it that's getting triggered in you, what conflict trap might you be falling into, and whether your response fits what's happening now, or whether it might be more reflective of a situation or a conflict you've had in the past that is causing you to jump to conclusions in the present or to predict a certain outcome that may not necessarily take shape. So for your reflection, we'd love for you to think a little bit about these conflict traps and to ask yourself, what conflict trap do you typically fall into the most? What do you notice in yourself? Is it that you tend to reflect that fight response in response to workplace conflicts? Do you tend to flee or try to run away or avoid? Do you freeze and just hope that it will go away if you do nothing or if you avoid it? Or do you fall into that people-pleasing response where you think, if I just sacrifice myself and try to please and do exactly what this other person or this team wants, maybe this conflict will just go away and we can move on? Think about what your tendencies are, and we'll have an opportunity to talk through those further in the Q&A.
Thanks, Heather. So now we want to come to the heart of the session, which is really how we repair conflict. So I want to paint you a picture of what conflict looks like in an organization when repair is not prioritized. When we see a situation when repair is not prioritized, we notice that even very small disagreements can slowly grow into something much larger. Again, we mentioned earlier what might begin as a very small disagreement or difference of opinion can turn into mistrust. It can turn into unhappiness, even high staff turnover, and just a loss of trust in leadership, where people stop feeling like they can speak up. At the governance level as well, when tensions remain unresolved and when repair is not prioritized, it can go beyond affecting relationships, but affect decisions. It can slow down big, important decisions, create uncertainty about strategy and the future. And this, in the end, as you can imagine, will affect every single one of you, every single member of the organization. This is why we want to emphasize how important it is to prioritize repair, because conflict itself is not the problem. It's inevitable in any organization. It's really about repairing it in the right way. So the key question is, how do we repair conflict in a way that is important and empowering for both the people in the organization and the organization itself?
So to repair conflict, a framework that we like to use is the 5 reasoning muscles, which you'll see here. And we'll talk a bit about each of these now. The first is to build an awareness of the situation and of what might be leading to our own response. So I think we've all probably been in a conflict, maybe with a family member, maybe at work or with a friend, where the scope isn't narrowed enough. And in the middle of the conflict, someone starts throwing all these different complaints at us, right? You always do this, but remember a time when you did that, right? So when you're trying to resolve conflict, that narrowing of the lens is really important. It's important to know what specific situation is triggering this and to keep focused on that narrow viewpoint rather than throwing in all the other things that you're upset with or all the other challenges in that dynamic, right? It's about being able to define an issue clearly and not trying to tackle everything all at once. Awareness is also about being aware of our own conflict patterns or those buttons that might be getting pushed and acknowledging when maybe our past experiences are impacting our response in the present. The second muscle that we try to build in repairing conflict is empathy. So, empathy is acknowledging the feelings and the impact on people involved in the conflict. Put simply, empathy is the capacity for participating in another's feelings or ideas. If we're empathetic around conflict, we're at least trying to understand the other person and where they might be coming from, even if we don't agree with them. Empathy is not about agreeing with another person's viewpoint, it's about trying to understand that other person's viewpoint, what might be at stake for them, and what might be coming up for them in this conflict. With empathy or empathetic responses, we're pausing and we're thinking about the impact of our words on other people involved, and we allow that to shape our response. The third muscle is humility. Humility is the ability to acknowledge our own potential wrongness in the conflict. Humility might sound like, I can see how you may be feeling that way, right? Or I can understand how my response might have impacted you in that way. Again, doesn't necessarily mean agreement. It just means mutual understanding and acknowledging our role in it. If all parties can acknowledge their part in the conflict, it can help build that spirit of collaboration and understanding, which helps in the negotiating process. Humility can also help us choose what really matters to us in the conflict and how we want to work through it. And it might allow us to let go of some of the things that don't really matter, which we're more open to negotiating on as we work through resolving the conflict. The fourth muscle here is reliability. So many instances in conflict resolution, people and teams get stuck in this step. We may name what we intend to do and what we want to change as a result of working through conflict, but we might not actually follow through. So, reliability is agreeing on next steps and holding ourselves and other people accountable to that, figuring out a system to check back in and make sure that we actually follow through in making those changes. Being reliable means that our actions follow our statements of intent, and what we do is consistent with what we say. And the fifth muscle here that we want to develop is taking responsibility. So, this is again committing to adapt our behavior, not just what we say, but what we do, taking responsibility fully, and then checking back in. So, once we have an awareness of our role in the conflict, we have an opportunity to take responsibility. We respond with empathy and humility. Responsibility is that final step where we follow through and then we agree to adapt if necessary. So, if you find yourself in a conflict that keeps repeating over and over and isn't ever reaching full resolution, it may be the case that one of these reasoning muscles isn't being fully utilized to the fullest. These may sound like quite practical skills, but they're quite a bit harder to apply in practice, especially when emotions and tensions are high. But when applied together, they can help create the foundation for genuine repair and help us problem solve when repair isn't feeling possible or when we're getting stuck in different phases of conflict.
Absolutely. And those 5 reasoning muscles really give you a sense of how to prioritize repair in practical ways, right? But even though we presented those 5 reasoning muscles as individual tools, they're not just about how you as an individual handle conflict, but they directly affect the organization as a whole. So I previously described what conflict would look like in an organization that doesn't prioritize repair. So I want to do the same thing, but present a situation of what it looks like in an organization when we do prioritize repair. So this would occur on every level from the leadership level. When leaders take responsibility and accountability for their part in a conflict, it sets the tone that accountability matters at every single level. And that essentially, at the end of the day, you are all part of a team. And we've seen that this makes it easier for staff to speak up to leadership, to anyone, no matter their seniority. It builds better relationships and it strengthens trust, which is the most important thing. Similarly, when departments or country sections are able to name their differences or name their conflict styles, it helps them to avoid months of stalled projects or duplicated work and just work together in a much more cohesive way. We've noticed that decisions will be made faster, with clearer direction, and most importantly, with a genuine commitment from everyone involved. And of course, at the individual level, this matters just as much. Going into work every day, I want you to imagine a situation where every single one of you believe that you can speak up, you can raise issues, and you can be heard. At the end of the day, if that is the case, you will feel so much more valued and so much more respected. And you hopefully won't carry around frustration or burnout in silence. But instead, we want to create a situation where everyone in the organization feels more engaged, more resilient, and more connected to the mission. And hopefully, this will have a positive ripple effect across the whole organization. But finally, before we wrap up, because I'm conscious of the time, we really want to acknowledge that what we're sharing today, Heather and I, it really just scratches the surface. Conflict resolution is never simple, and we don't mean to trivialize the kinds of very complex and protracted situations and conflicts that you encounter at Amnesty. What this session was really hoping to achieve is to give you a very basic toolkit, a starting point for how to first approach conflict, how to understand your own conflict responses, and how our support and everyone else's support can help build around that. In a global movement like Amnesty, this kind of collaboration and empowerment is really what keeps the organization effective and coherent. So thank you so much for listening and reflecting with us along the way. As we mentioned, We have given you some reflection questions to think about throughout the session, and now we will open the Q&A section for questions from the floor.
Thank you so much, Maya and Heather. Excellent presentation. I'm sure there's lots in there that our colleagues will resonate with. And so now is your chance to ask those questions, colleagues, or share reflections or observations that you had. The Q&A function is open now, but the chat is not open. So that just keeps everything in one place. You can also raise your hands, and I see some people are starting to do that. So Heather and Maya, I'll hand back to you to take questions as they arise. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. All right. We will attempt to do them in the right order, but I'll go ahead and start with Isabel. Feel free to unmute and ask your question.
Isabel Simón Espa. Hola, voy a hablar en castellano si no os importa. Vamos a ver, primero os agradezco muchísimo a las dos personas que habéis llevado el taller por la claridad, por la claridad en el sentido de que nos ha ordenado ideas. Cuando empezasteis, yo estaba pensando en un conflicto que hemos tenido, como todas las organizaciones que hemos tenido que gestionar, un conflicto externo a nuestro equipo de dirección, pero que por supuesto, ha podido crear y ha creado algunas disensiones dentro del equipo directivo. Entonces, en ese sentido, las 5 o 4 los tipos de conflicto, a mí me han parecido que evidentemente no están claramente definidos cuando hay un conflicto, y más aún es que son bastante interseccionales, por definirlo de alguna manera, porque nosotros hemos tenido un proceso de toma de decisión complejo, porque el conflicto externo sobre el que hemos tenido que tomar la decisión ha sido doloroso en una organización como la nuestra, cuando tenemos que tomar decisiones a veces duras hacia otras personas. Y por el otro lado, eso nos ha creado un conflicto a nivel de relaciones interpersonales de abordarlo, la aplicación de la toma de decisiones, no tanto de la propia toma de decisiones como de la aplicación de la toma de decisiones. Y por supuesto han surgido elementos de identidad y de poder que siempre existen en todos los equipos. Y eso es lo que nos ha generado más problemas a nivel de gestión interna del conflicto, y además nos ha de alguna manera dejado una sensación de que puede de alguna manera dañar la cohesión interna del equipo, que hasta este momento ha funcionado fenomenal. Evidentemente hay un elemento que hay que tomar en cuenta, y creo que es y que son las diferencias culturales que tenemos incluso dentro de nuestras propias secciones, y lo que habéis también comentado de algunos conflictos larvados que pueden incluso tener en su origen diferencias de carácter, diferencias personales, diferencias incluso de expresarse. Es que entonces, después de esa larguísima introducción, que me vais a perdonar, es cómo podemos solucionar eso sin seguir siendo cohesionados y seguir estando cohesionados.
Thank you so much,
Before you
Isabel.
respond, would you like to
your-
take a few questions at a time and and answer collectively or one at a time?
Maybe for this one, since there were a couple points to it, we'll respond to this one now, and then we can take a few collectively. Maya, why don't you handle the organizational dynamic piece
Mhm.
and cultural, and then I'll follow up with some of the personal differences and things
Yeah.
that we can do when those arise.
Okay. Thank you so much, Isabel, for sharing what sounds like a pretty personal and emotional conflict for you. I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that. I know it's not easy. Um, you're absolutely right that, we listed types of conflict and we listed those 5 reasoning muscles, but they overlap, especially in a complex conflict like what you described. They will always overlap. I think the advice I would give you firstly is that it would not be a simple situation. It would not be a simple, one conversation of identifying the conflict and working through it. It would probably take multiple sessions to kind of work through the different layers of the conflict. When we identify the types of the conflict, I think what might be helpful is for you and your team to identify maybe the main type of conflict or the main 2 types of conflict. There are usually 2 that are kind of at the heart of the conflict. And like Heather said, it's always easier to simplify and then expand as opposed to trying to tackle 15 different aspects of the conflict at once. If you come together with your team and you're like, okay, let's really think about what is the core of this conflict? How did this start? What was the main type of conflict that triggered all of this? And once you're able to identify that as a first step, you can then take the following types of conflict as secondary steps. But again, like I mentioned at the end, it's such a complex process. And a lot of the time when we're dealing with complex conflicts like this, it can take weeks, it can take months, many, many conversations, external people coming in, internal people supporting you. So we are not at all trying to trivialize the situation. And if you would like to speak about this in more detail, our contact details will be available at the end. We're happy to, have a separate conversation to really deal with this with you.
And what you spoke to about, external decisions or external conflict then trickling down and impacting internal dynamics. Of course, we see this, very, very often. We know that this is a very trying time. All times are trying when it comes to human rights abuses around the world, but especially a trying time in this sector, and this type of work at Amnesty International. And so there are very difficult decisions being made. There are financial challenges around the world in NGO spaces, and that can impact people personally, which creates more conflict and more stress. I think when you talk about connections being ruptured or about, internal disagreements and relationships, these reasoning muscles can really be applied in many different spaces. So that empathy and humility go a very, very long way in repairing. And we like to have people think creatively about how to do that. So if you notice conflict happening in a group environment, maybe you actually seek out individuals and you work on validating their experience in a one-on-one meeting. That might sound like, acknowledging, I know these external decisions have been very hard on you. I know it feels like your team or your role is being more attacked in this decision. I can imagine you feeling or experiencing this way. So often, people just need to feel heard and be acknowledged in the middle of a conflict. And when they don't feel heard, it starts to, again, elicit that threat response. Maybe I'm not safe in my role. Maybe, change is going to happen and it's going to create a problem for me in the future or my team. So people start to panic and then they get louder in how they respond. So if we can help people feel heard, acknowledge what they might be experiencing and validate them, and then work on connection. Maybe that means, again, having one-on-one coffee chats or checking in with them about how they're doing outside of work. How are they taking care of themselves? Offering something that's more of that personal connection in the midst of this conflict dynamic that can help build or repair connections that are being ruptured at the same time. We often work with teams as well who are in the midst of conflict. And sometimes, it may sound cliche, but team building exercises, ways for people to connect as humans and see each other as humans and as people in all of these decisions, that can be really helpful in just working through and repairing what's happening in the environment.
And one last thing, Isabel, I wanted to add on. I think just from the way you describe the conflict to us, it's clear that you have already done a lot of analysis on regarding the conflict. I think that's an important first step. You were able to identify what you thought were the types of conflict at play. You were able to identify that there were cultural differences at play, and that is so important. And that's really the first step in addressing it. So yeah, happy to talk through this more with you later. Shall we take a question from Claudia?
Let's do that. And then we'll jump over and answer one from the Q&A. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Claudia.
Thank you, Maya and Heather. It was very clear, and thank you for this introduction to this issue. I wanted to ask you kind of your best advice on a complex situation in which there is kind of severe organizational trauma. So every single person in the organization is traumatized by past conflict, and they don't trust each other. So the situation is, of course, the individuals that created the conflict originally are not there anymore, but the trust has been lost completely within the team, to the board, to everyone. So in this kind of very complex situation in which nobody trusts anyone, they don't trust their colleagues, they don't trust their leadership, they don't trust any of the organs in Amnesty also, which includes International Secretariat, International Board. So kind of severe distrust. What would be your best advice to repair this trust issue? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Claudia. As we mentioned before, we recognize this is a very, very difficult time across the organization and across this type of work globally. So I think, part of what we spoke to around conflict traps really highlights this point that oftentimes we respond to current conflict based on what our conflict map is in our brain. And we can create these conflict maps for the organization too, right? So even if you are a new manager of mine, I'm likely already having a reaction to you based on how my old manager treated me. So in that way, I think we all have responsibility as individuals to think about and pause before we respond. Again, this is a muscle that takes time to develop, but trying to pause and say, am I responding to Claudia as Claudia, or am I thinking about her as how I would respond to my past manager or my past experience? How can I pause and really listen and tune into what I'm hearing right now in the present instead of responding based on how things have always been? So I think that that means an openness to trying something different. It means catching where our stress is at and what assumptions we're making when news is delivered to us, and trying to pause before we react immediately based on those assumptions. Gather information, use some skills to regulate ourselves and build trust before we respond. Trust building, I think, is also really essential at the group level, the team level. It really cycles out across the organization. I think building trust can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes it means naming these patterns verbally in meetings. Even, you just shared really bravely about what you're noticing in terms of patterns and a real breakdown of trust across the entire system. I think when leaders can highlight that and name it it helps bring down defenses. It helps people feel validated. So doing that really intentionally at the start of meetings, we recognize that it might be hard to trust what we're saying right now based on what we've all been through. We know that people have been really angry about decisions that are made, and it's hard to feel like the values of leadership align with, your core values as a worker. Naming those discrepancies, naming that people may not feel safe or trust others, and then trying to, again, kind of tackle things from a very present focused view, and teaching skills sometimes in meetings to do that. Maya, do you have anything to
Yeah.
add?
Just a small thing. Again, I think this might be beneficial to follow up with you in a separate conversation, but building on what Heather said about trust, I found in similar conflicts, it is so helpful to form little groups or little clusters where you can feel connected to each other again, whether that is, going to have a drink with a few people and just talking about it and realizing that everybody is in the same boat. I know it can feel very isolating when there's a situation like this where trust is fractured, everyone is upset, nobody really wants to connect or talk about it. But I think the moment people realize that you're kind of all in this together, you're all in this pretty difficult situation together, that is already the first step in building connection. And if you kind of maybe put people in small groups, or maybe even start with people that you feel close to, and just, have a sit down meal or have a sit down session and just very openly give people a safe space to talk about what is going on, to talk about how they're feeling. That is a very kind of good way to start the repair process. But again, something that's a protracted conflict like this, it takes time, and there are so many different layers to unpack. But I think you're doing a great job in already identifying this, coming to this session, and working through it with us. So thank you for sharing, Claudia.
Thanks for the answer.
So we'll jump over briefly to the Q&A list, and then we'll tackle more of the raised hands. So first, a question from Andy. Andy asked, when would a mediator come into play to go between the two parties to resolve or settle conflicts? Maya, why don't you take that one?
That's a really good question, and it's something that we get asked a lot. I think when a mediator is supposed to come or get involved when two parties, or whichever parties are involved, they feel like they can't work together anymore. It usually reaches a point where both parties feel that they're not able to resolve things on their own when they call on an external mediator to come in. So it's really as simple as that. And of course, there are also situations where people want to prevent conflict, and they want to prevent it from escalating, and they can call in a mediator to help. So I don't think there's a right or wrong time to call in a mediator. It's really, subjective to the people who are involved in the conflict. But yeah, essentially the purpose of an external mediator coming in is somebody who's completely objective, who's completely neutral, who will be able to ensure both parties or both voices are heard and create that safe space for a dialogue to take place.
And I think, Caroline will speak more to this, but one of the core purposes of this new approach to conflict resolution within the movement is to try to tackle these conflicts before they balloon and become much larger, right? So that's why you will have these resources, these vetted conflict resolution practitioners who are easily accessible and responsive, and can hopefully, tackle conflicts more when they are first brewing, rather than when they've reached the stage of being a full-blown crisis and impacting more and more teams and more levels of the organization. Yeah. A couple other questions from the Q&A. So someone asked anonymously, are there tips to succeed in avoiding traps and repair conflicts? Rationally, we are aware, but when it happens, sometimes it seems difficult to avoid falling into these traps. And I can pair these responses together. Another question was, how effective are the repair strategies when they're used by one party to the conflict, but not the other? So great questions there. When it comes to avoiding traps and repairing conflicts, this really is about personal individual strategies. And the biggest thing that we recommend here is building in a pause. So when our threat response system gets activated, we start to panic, and usually we intuitively respond based on how we've responded in the past to conflict, right? So anything that we can do to slow down that automatic response and respond more intentionally is really, really helpful. Now, if you're in the middle of a heated discussion in a board meeting, for example, it can be very hard to pause that response. But that may look like literally pausing, pulling back a little bit from the computer, taking 3 intentional deep breaths before you react and respond. If you have a little bit more time, maybe that means saying to a colleague, I really need to put some thought in this. I really want to respond to this in an intentional, thoughtful way. I can feel myself getting amped up or reacting. What if we pause and we agree to talk more about this tomorrow? What if we put a meeting, we give ourselves a week to think on this? Maybe there isn't a week, maybe there's a day, but give ourselves a little time to think on this, clear our minds, and come back to it with a really intentional repairing approach. Ways to interrupt that stress response, threat response cycle are really important. So taking a step back, building in a pause, asking someone to meet again if you notice yourself getting activated or them getting activated, those would be some key tips for interrupting that cycle and coming at it with more intention and self-awareness. The question about how effective it is if one person is using it, of course, it's going to be probably a smoother conflict resolution process if both are able to tap into some of these resources and are practicing self-awareness in the process, right? But even if only one person is aware, it can still be productive. What it means is hopefully it's avoiding that pattern of one person getting escalated and escalating it, and the other person playing off of them and escalating it further or avoiding. It can still interrupt the pattern if you're aware of the pattern and you're kind of excusing yourself from it or calling attention to it. Sometimes if you're the one that's trying, of course, we all often feel like we're the one who's doing it right and the other person isn't, right? But if you notice yourself catching these traps and it doesn't seem that the other person is aware of it, sometimes there are gentle things we can say to bring attention to that. I notice that we're kind of saying the same things and we might not be hearing each other. Maybe we can take a break and we can come back to this thinking both about what matters to us and what the other person might be feeling here. Sometimes little gentle nudges or reminders to increase empathy, increase awareness, or narrow the scope, that can be helpful. And it might bring the other person along in terms of their insight or their participation a little more.
Let's take Judith since we're coming to the end now. Judith, feel free to unmute and share your question.
Hola. Hola, soy Judith Pacheco de Amnistía Internacional Venezuela. Gracias por esta oportunidad y por este seminario tan importante. Son 2 preguntas rapidito. ¿Cómo identificar y gestionar de manera constructiva las dinámicas de poder internas dentro de la organización para evitar o por lo menos de alguna manera poder tener la oportunidad de no evitar los conflictos, pero sí de alguna manera poder gestionarlos mejor? Y otra pregunta sería, ¿cómo se puede promover un liderazgo compartido que respete la autonomía local sin debilitar la coherencia global y viceversa? Esas son mis 2 preguntas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Judith. I can take the first question on power dynamics. That's a really good question, and it's something that you will see across all organizations, not just human rights organizations. So I think when we are talking about managing internal power dynamics, one thing that helps from the beginning is recognizing and naming it, because power in itself isn't a bad thing. But I think a lot of the time the issue comes from unacknowledged power, or people feeling that that power is causing them harm in some way. So starting out, I think just having a process where you can name power dynamics as a first step. So naming titles, seniority, or even resources that shape how people experience conflict. I hope that makes sense. Addressing those power dynamics really means creating processes where everyone feels safe to speak regardless of position. So, for example, if you were to set up a meeting with your team and acknowledge everybody's role in that meeting. So acknowledge, okay, this is a senior manager, this is an intern, this is an analyst, or whatever titles that you use. But then say, but in this space, everyone's voice is equal and everyone has equal representation. Everyone should feel safe to share regardless of their position. And encourage people to share some of their issues with the power dynamics. A lot of the time we've noticed leaders and managers, they're not trying to intentionally stifle junior people in the team, but because of long-standing power structures, especially in an organization like Amnesty, which has been running for so long, it's hard to break the way certain things run. And leaders play a key role in managing power dynamics because they model accountability. So they should be the first to initiate, this is an open space. We are inviting feedback. We are inviting to tell us if we're doing something wrong, if you don't feel that you can speak up as a junior member. I think that is something that we've noticed can help in the past, creating one meeting where everybody has equal say. And I'm not sure the position you're in, but if you are aware of people who are junior, having one-on-one conversations with them and empowering them to speak up, whether it's to you or to other people in leadership, that is the first step. I think empowering junior members or empowering people who feel shut out or feel that they're not heard, whether that's in a big space or in one-on-one sessions, is helpful.
All right, Caroline, we will pass it over to you to share the final resources. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very, very much, Heather and Maya, for joining us for your excellent session. And thank you to all of the participants here today as well, and for your excellent questions. There are 4 more webinars in this series covering different aspects of conflict resolution and featuring more from our expert roster of conflict resolution practitioners. And we really hope that you can join as many of those as possible. You'll see on the slide that's being shown now where you can find more information about the conflict resolution process and all of the resources that are available to you. You can contact the Movement Building Program on conflict resolution at amnesty.org. You can access the conflict resolution page on the Amnesty Leadership website. You can contact one of the conflict resolution resource people or one of our experts, such as Maya and Heather from the roster. And we also have a core standards guidance note on ethical handling of conflicts and complaints. And you'll also find that on the Amnesty Leadership website. All of that information will be shared with you via email after the webinar, along with a very short evaluation. Please take a moment to complete that so we can keep improving our services to you. Thank you once again for your participation. Thank you again to Maya and Heather. And thank you to Sophia and the interpreters for supporting this meeting. Wishing you all a good day. Thank you.